On the morning of May 7, 2025, the Indian government launched a highly coordinated and strategic military operation named Operation Sindoor, targeting terror camps located across the line of control, low sea in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. The operation was a direct response to the brutal terrorist attack that occurred in Pahalgam, Jammu and Kashmir on April 22, where 27 civilians, including women and children, lost their lives in a calculated and indiscriminate assault attributed to militant groups based in Pakistan. The Indian government, after several days of deliberation and gathering intelligence, authorized precision strikes on what it described as active terror launchpads and logistics hubs. According to official sources, 9 key locations believed to be controlled or used by terrorist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Taiba-J-e-Mohammed GM, and Hizbul Mujahideen were targeted simultaneously. These groups have long been accused of receiving support and safe haven from elements within Pakistan's military and intelligence services. Unlike previous retaliatory actions, Operation Sindoor was carried out with greater stealth, technological precision, and minimal risk to civilian life on either side of the border. The Indian Air Force deployed advanced drones, satellite-guided missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles UAVs to conduct the strikes during the early hours, minimizing the chance of detection and counteraction. Reports from ground intelligence and surveillance suggest significant damage was inflicted on the infrastructure used to train and harbor militants, including weapons depots, communication centers, and underground bunkers. The Indian Ministry of Defense emphasized that the operation was designed to be a limited and targeted counter-terrorism response, not a declaration of war. A statement released shortly after the strikes read, "India retains the sovereign right to protect its citizens from acts of terror. The action taken today is proportionate, necessary, and intended solely to degrade the capabilities of those who continue to inflict violence upon our soil." However, the response from Pakistan was immediate and sharp. The Pakistani military condemned the operation, terming it an unprovoked aggression, and claimed that the strikes resulted in civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in areas far removed from any terrorist activity. Pakistan's Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Committee and vowed to retaliate at a time and place of our choosing. Pakistan also moved forward with diplomatic efforts to internationalize the issue, approaching the United Nations and major global powers to condemn what it called India's violation of international law. The situation quickly escalated into a high alert phase along the low sea and the international border. Indian and Pakistani forces were put on heightened alert, with civilian populations near border areas instructed to remain indoors or seek shelter in designated bunkers. Cross-border shelling was reported in several sectors, leading to injuries and panic among local communities. Despite the volatility, Indian officials reiterated that their intention was to neutralize a specific threat and prevent further terrorist infiltration into Jammu and Kashmir. Strategic analysts in New Delhi have highlighted that Operation Sindoor also carried a broader political and strategic message. With the general elections approaching in India and public outrage over the Pahalgam attacks still raw, the government likely felt pressured to demonstrate a firm and decisive approach to national security. At the same time, the operation sent a signal to the international community that India will no longer tolerate a cycle of provocation and restraint when dealing with cross-border terrorism. International reactions were cautious but largely supportive of India's right to self-defense. The United States issued a statement urging both countries to avoid further escalation, but acknowledged India's right to protect its citizens from terrorism. France and the United Kingdom echoed similar sentiments, while Russia called for restraint and offered to mediate peace talks. China, a close ally of Pakistan, expressed grave concern over the developments and urged both sides to resolve their differences through dialogue. India's internal response to Operation Sindoor has been marked by a mixture of patriotic fervor and anxiety over the potential for wider conflict. News channels ran continuous coverage of the strike, with footage of Indian fighter jets taking off, maps of the targeted regions, and discussions among defense experts analyzing the implications. Social media was abuzz with hashtags supporting the Indian armed forces, while political leaders across the spectrum largely backed the government's decision, though some opposition figures called for increased transparency and long-term strategic planning. As of now, the Indian military remains on alert, with further operations not ruled out should the threat from across the border persist. The Indian government has also stepped up its diplomatic outreach to inform key allies and partners of the rationale behind Operation Sindoor, and to prevent any misinterpretation of its intent. Meanwhile, humanitarian agencies have begun preparations for the potential displacement of civilians in affected border regions, should the situation deteriorate further. In summary, Operation Sindoor marks a significant shift in India's counter-terrorism posture, signaling a more proactive and assertive approach to safeguarding its national security interests. While it has raised the specter of wider conflict, it also underscores the urgency of resolving the long-standing issues that fuel instability in the region. Whether the operation leads to deterrence or escalation remains to be seen, but for now it has undoubtedly altered the status quo along one of the most volatile borders in the world. Following India's launch of Operation Sindoor on May 7, 2025, a series of precision strikes targeting terror camps in Pakistan, administered territory, Pakistan responded swiftly, both militarily and diplomatically. The airstrikes had ignited a charged atmosphere, and what began as a counter-terrorism operation quickly evolved into a volatile and dangerous escalation between two nuclear-armed neighbors. Pakistan's retaliation was framed not only as a response to the alleged violation of its sovereignty, but also as a defense of its national dignity. Shortly after the Indian strikes, Pakistan's military claimed it had activated its air defense systems and responded by scrambling fighter jets in the affected areas. By mid-morning, Pakistan's Inter-Services Public Relations ISPA released a statement asserting that several Indian aircraft had violated Pakistani airspace and that its air force had successfully intercepted and brought down at least 2 Indian drones. The statement added that ground-based artillery units had responded with precision fire at what they described as Indian forward posts along the line of control low sea, causing material damage and inflicting casualties. Over the next 48 hours, exchanges of artillery fire and small arms skirmishes were reported from several sectors along the low sea, including Poonch, Rajaury, and Kupwara. Pakistani media aired footage of damaged homes and wounded civilians in border towns such as Kotli and Bimber. Government officials in Islamabad condemned the Indian strikes as naked aggression and accused New Delhi of fabricating a justification for cross-border attacks. Pakistan's Prime Minister convened an emergency session of the parliament, during which lawmakers from all parties unanimously denounced India's actions and vowed a united response. In his national address, the Pakistani Prime Minister called the Indian operation an irresponsible and dangerous provocation, and accused India of using the tragic Pahalgam attack as a pretext to pursue its geopolitical agenda. He warned that Pakistan's patience should not be mistaken for weakness, adding that the armed forces were fully prepared to respond in equal measure and beyond, if provoked further. He also appealed to the international community to intervene and hold India accountable for what he called a gross violation of international norms and territorial integrity. Pakistan's diplomatic machinery moved into high gear, reaching out to key allies such as China, Turkey, and members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. It also submitted formal complaints to the United Nations Security Council, urging an emergency session to address what it described as a deteriorating situation in South Asia. Pakistani diplomats argued that India's aggressive posture could trigger a full-scale war in a region already fraught with instability. While global reactions were measured, some countries, particularly China and Turkey, issued statements backing Pakistan's call for de-escalation and dialogue. On the ground, tensions were mounting not just at the low sea, but also in civilian communities close to the border. Residents on both sides of the low sea were instructed to remain indoors, and schools were closed indefinitely in affected districts. Emergency services were mobilized, and makeshift bunkers were reopened to shelter civilians from cross-border shelling. In some towns, people rushed to stock up on essential supplies, fearing that the situation might spiral into a broader conflict. Reports of panic-induced displacement began to emerge, particularly in the Neelam Valley and areas near the Sialkot border. Meanwhile, Pakistan's military continued to mobilize forces in key sectors, moving additional troops and artillery units to sensitive points along the low sea and the working boundary. Fighter jets conducted aerial patrols throughout the day, maintaining a visible presence intended to deter any further action by India. Military spokespersons warned that while Pakistan was not seeking war, it would respond decisively to any repeat of what it called India's aggression. Social media platforms in Pakistan became a hub of nationalist sentiment, with hashtags trending in support of the armed forces and critical of Indian policies in Kashmir. Media channels ran non-stop coverage, including interviews with retired generals and defense analysts who stressed the need for a firm and calculated response. The coverage also focused heavily on civilian casualties, showing images of injured children and destroyed homes, which further inflamed public emotions. At the same time, calls for peace emerged from sections of Pakistani civil society. Prominent intellectuals, activists, and former diplomats urged both governments to exercise restraint and resume diplomatic dialogue. There were appeals to avoid repeating the mistakes of past conflicts, which had resulted in immense human and economic losses without resolving underlying issues. Religious leaders from different sects held joint prayers for peace and urged followers not to succumb to hatred or misinformation. By May 9, with the situation still tense and the possibility of further retaliatory action looming, international actors began to step up their efforts to mediate. The United Nations Secretary-General issued a statement urging both nations to step back from the brink and resume talks. The United States and several European nations quietly initiated back-channel communications with both New Delhi and Islamabad in an attempt to defuse the crisis. However, the lack of direct communication between the two governments continued to hinder any meaningful progress toward de-escalation. In essence, Pakistan's retaliation was not just a military maneuver, it was also a complex interplay of domestic pressure, international diplomacy, and strategic signaling. While the full scope of damage and casualties remains unclear, what is certain is that the already fragile peace between India and Pakistan has been severely tested. As the world watches anxiously, the region stands on the precipice of yet another cycle of conflict, the consequences of which would be far, etching and potentially devastating for millions of lives on both sides of the border. As tensions between India and Pakistan surged following the launch of India's Operation Sindoor on May 7, 2025, the global community closely monitored the situation with growing concern. Among the first major international actors to issue a formal response was China, which urged both nations to exercise restraint and avoid actions that could escalate the conflict into a broader regional crisis. China's statement, delivered through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs and reiterated by senior officials including its ambassador to Pakistan, underscored the country's strategic interests in South Asia and its desire to maintain regional stability. China's response was carefully worded but clear in tone. In an official press briefing, a spokesperson from the Chinese Foreign Ministry stated, "China is deeply concerned about the recent developments in South Asia. We urge both India and Pakistan to exercise maximum restraint, avoid further confrontation, and resolve their differences through dialogue and diplomatic means. Peace and stability in the region serve the interests of all parties." The spokesperson added that China was ready to play a constructive role in facilitating communication if both parties were willing. This diplomatic appeal was not made in isolation. It came after a high-level meeting between Pakistan's Prime Minister and the Chinese ambassador in Islamabad, during which Pakistan shared its version of events, framing India's actions as unjustified aggression. China's subsequent remarks suggested that while it understood Pakistan's concerns, it also wanted to prevent the situation from deteriorating into a full-blown war. The balanced yet concerned tone of China's message reflected the complex nature of its relationships with both countries. China's position in the India-Pakistan equation has always been nuanced. While Beijing is a close strategic ally of Islamabad, investing heavily in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC) and collaborating on military projects, it also maintains substantial economic ties with New Delhi. China's call for restraint, therefore, was not merely a diplomatic formality, but a strategic necessity aimed at protecting its interests across the region. Any escalation between India and Pakistan could disrupt trade routes, jeopardize infrastructure projects, and increase geopolitical risks in territories where China has invested billions of dollars. In the days following the initial strikes, Chinese media carried editorials that called for diplomacy and stability. Government-backed publications like the Global Times and People's daily emphasized the dangers of allowing historical grievances to spiral into modern-day warfare. They cautioned that both India and Pakistan, as nuclear-armed powers, bore a special responsibility to avoid brinkmanship. Analysts writing in Chinese think tanks also warned of the unpredictable ripple effects that such a conflict could have on regional security, including the potential for refugee flows, disruptions in cross-border trade, and the diversion of military resources from other critical areas. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts intensified. Chinese officials reportedly reached out through informal channels to both New Delhi and Islamabad, encouraging the resumption of dialogue and the establishment of deconfliction protocols. While India did not immediately respond to these overtures publicly, sources suggested that Chinese diplomats were in regular contact with South Bloc, emphasizing the risks of sustained conflict and advocating for a return to back-channel talks. China's involvement also drew the attention of other global powers. The United States, European Union, and Russia observed China's response closely, aware that Beijing's role could significantly influence the trajectory of the conflict. Some Western analysts speculated that China's growing stature on the world stage could position it as a potential mediator, especially given the trust it enjoys in Pakistan and its increasingly pragmatic approach toward India in recent years. However, India's strategic community responded cautiously to China's statements. While Indian officials welcomed calls for restraint from all countries, there was noticeable skepticism about Beijing's neutrality. India has long viewed China's partnership with Pakistan, particularly in the context of Sea-Pek passing through Pakistan, administered Kashmir, as a direct challenge to its territorial claims and sovereignty. Moreover, past border tensions between India and China, including the 2020 Galwan Valley clash, have left deep mistrust. As a result, New Delhi was unlikely to embrace China as a facilitator in any bilateral talks with Pakistan. Despite this skepticism, the urgency of the situation meant that all voices advocating peace were valuable. Civil society groups, retired diplomats, and strategic experts across the region applauded China's call for de-escalation. Many noted that the increasing polarization in South Asia made such appeals from influential global powers essential in averting catastrophe. With both Indian and Pakistani media amplifying nationalist sentiments, external moderation could help temper public discourse and reduce pressure on political and military leaders to act reactively. On the ground, the situation remained fragile. Cross-border firing continued intermittently, and both militaries stayed on high alert. Yet, the absence of immediate large-scale retaliation after the initial exchanges suggested that the message from China and other international actors might be having a moderating effect. Whether that moderation could be sustained in the long term remained uncertain, but at least in the immediate aftermath, it created a small window for diplomacy. In conclusion, China's call for restraint in the wake of the India-Pakistan flare-up was a reminder of the interconnected nature of modern conflicts. No regional crisis remains confined to its immediate borders for long. With interests in peace, trade, and stability across South Asia, China chose a path of careful diplomacy. Its statements reinforced the importance of dialogue and underscored the necessity for major powers to play a proactive, peace-promoting role in a region long shadowed by historic rivalry and modern insecurity. In the midst of heightened tensions between India and Pakistan following the military operation dubbed Operation Sindoor, global attention turned not only to diplomatic and strategic developments, but also to the voices of prominent public figures advocating for peace. Among the most notable was Priyanka Chopra Jonas, internationally renowned actress, producer, and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, who once again reiterated her long-standing anti-war stance. Her statements, made through social media and public appearances, served as a reminder of the crucial role that cultural influencers play in shaping public discourse during times of crisis. Priyanka Chopra, known for her humanitarian work and advocacy on global issues, spoke out shortly after reports of cross-border military strikes and retaliations began to circulate in the media. In a carefully worded post on her verified platforms, she expressed deep concern over the rising conflict between the two neighboring countries. She wrote, "War is not the answer. We must find ways to build peace, not walls of hate." As someone who has represented both India and global humanitarian causes, I firmly believe that dialogue, understanding, and compassion must guide our path forward. This message, though brief, resonated deeply with her millions of followers around the world. It also served as a continuation of her public opposition to war and violence in all forms, a position she has maintained despite past controversies surrounding her views on national security. In particular, Priyanka had faced criticism in 2019 for a tweet supporting the Indian Armed Forces, which some interpreted as being in favor of military action during a previous India-Pakistan standoff. At the time, she clarified her stance in multiple interviews, asserting that being patriotic did not equate to being pro-war. "I've always believed in peace. I support the men and women who serve and protect, but I do not support war. It causes unimaginable pain to families, communities, and nations. She stated during a 2020 interview, and these words were echoed again in her most recent remarks in 2025. In reaffirming her anti-war beliefs now, during yet another critical moment in South Asian history, she sought to bridge the gap between national identity and humanitarian principles. Priyanka's position is especially significant because of her influential status in both Bollywood and Hollywood. As someone who has worked across cultures and built a global platform, her words carry weight in international conversations. Media outlets across the United States, the UK, and South Asia reported on her remarks, many praising her courage for speaking up during a time when voices for peace are often drowned out by calls for retribution and nationalism. Her perspective was particularly relevant given her role as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, where she has been a vocal advocate for children's rights, refugee welfare, and education. In her recent statement, she also drew attention to the humanitarian consequences of war, particularly for the most vulnerable group, children and women. It is always the innocent who suffer the most. We must do everything in our power to prevent the suffering of those who have no part in conflict, yet bear its heaviest burden, she wrote. Chopra's statement sparked a wave of discussion on social media, with many supporters applauding her stand while others questioned her for interfering in complex political issues. Yet, what set her message apart was not only its clarity but its empathy. She refrained from assigning blame or siding with any particular narrative, focusing instead on the universal cost of conflict. In a time when public figures are often either silent or polarized, her call for unity, dialogue, and peace provided a balanced and much-needed alternative. In interviews that followed, Priyanka emphasized the importance of empathy in international relations. We're all people. Politics divides, but humanity connects. I truly believe that through mutual respect, empathy, and communication, we can address even the most entrenched problems, she said during a live-streamed discussion with youth peace activists. She also pledged to support initiatives that promote peacebuilding and cross-border cultural exchanges, highlighting the role of art and dialogue in healing historical wounds. Furthermore, she made an appeal to media professionals and content creators to be responsible in how they portray conflict and national identities. Media shapes perception. We must be careful not to fan flames of hate, but instead foster understanding, she noted, referencing the need for both Indian and Pakistani media outlets to engage in ethical and fact-based reporting. Her message found an audience among young people in particular, many of whom shared her sentiments and expressed a desire to see their countries engage in dialogue rather than warfare. Hashtags like #PeaceNotWar and #VoicesForPeace began trending on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram shortly after her post, amplifying the call for de-escalation and peaceful resolution. Beyond the digital space, Priyanka Chopra's influence also reached policy and humanitarian circles. Several NGOs working in conflict resolution cited her statement as a powerful example of how celebrity advocacy can contribute to peace efforts. Some even suggested that more public figures from both countries should step forward and use their platforms to advocate for dialogue and reconciliation. In conclusion, Priyanka Chopra's reaffirmation of her anti-war stance during the 2025 India-Pakistan crisis served as a powerful reminder that the voices for peace must not fall silent, especially in times of conflict. Her message, grounded in compassion and informed by her humanitarian experience, called not just for restraint, but for a reimagining of how nations can engage with one another. At a time when divisions run deep and fears of escalation loom large, voices like hers serve as a beacon, reminding the world that empathy, not enmity, is the path to a more peaceful future.